Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to Granite Lake in the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness in the Shoshone National Forest in northwest Wyoming. Granite Lake is a subalpine lake that sits at about 8,200 feet in elevation and can be accessed on the Muddy Creek Trail. The rolling mountains around it are shrouded by stands of Engelmann spruce, subalpine fir, whitebark pine, and lodgepole pine, woven through stands of cottonwood and quaking aspen. The forest floor is dappled with grasses, wildflowers, and sagebrush. This terrain is home to elk, mule deer, and moose, as well as a few mountain goats and bighorn sheep. The predators here include coyotes, cougars, black bears, and a grizzly bear population that is rather intolerant of human interlopers. On Sunday 9th, 2018, 48-year-old Dr. Brad Johnson was spending time relaxing in the Beartooths along with a few of his closest friends. Johnson was an ear, nose, and throat specialist and a surgeon by profession. He practiced at Oakdale Ear, Nose, and Throat Clinic in Minneapolis, Minnesota, but resided in Plymouth. The four men had developed their relationship while attending Plymouth Covenant Church together for over 20 years. On this trip, 48-year-old Corcoran business owner Tom Therian, 49-year-old tech executive Todd Green, and 45-year-old Minneapolis fire captain Justin Reed were Johnson's company. This was their third trip to the Beartooths, which was one of their favorite hiking destinations to visit. They rarely saw another person on their previous trips, and that was part of their enjoyment. They seemed to have the Beartooths all to themselves, apart from the grizzlies that lived there, of course. The men had driven nonstop from the Twin Cities to their departure destination, the Clay Butte Lookout Trail, arriving at around 9 a.m. on Sunday, September 9th. The doctor couldn't have picked better company on this trip, given Reed was a trained EMT as part of his firefighter training. Now, before they had left Minnesota, the men had assigned certain tasks to each other, and Green's was to bring a tarp. He was the newbie of the group, and this was his first trip to the Beartooths, so he was automatically the butt of their jokes. That's just how guys work. The rest of the group mocked him a bit when he pulled out his assigned gear. It was a giant tarp, a giant white tarp. Green's ribbing didn't end when he pulled out his large camera case and dangled it from around his neck. They chided him, but he insisted they were going to get some amazing photos to remember this trip. As soon as the men parked their vehicles, they pulled their packs onto their shoulders and hit the trail, like giddy children. At any promising point on the lake, they would take a rest and drown a few flies while pulling rainbow, cutthroat, and brown trout out of the cool, clear waters. Their goal was to hike 8 miles to the far side of Granite Lake and pitch camp. The hike would only take them a few hours, so they were in no hurry, allowing them extra time to fish along the way. The men were prepared for the rigors of the hike and even packed a canister of bear spray apiece. They knew the grizzlies were around and took every precaution necessary to keep themselves as safe as possible. After a few miles, the 65-pound backpacks the men were carrying were taking their toll, especially on Green. Being the helpful friend he was, Johnson carefully pulled the heavy camera and case from around Green's neck and continued up the trail as it swung from its tethers just beneath his chest around his neck. Dr. Johnson was a very fit man, so he had a slightly faster hiking pace than the rest of the men. By about 1 p.m., he had slipped about 400 yards ahead of the group, with only 1 mile left to reach the campground at Granite Lake. As he walked, Johnson held his bear spray in his hand. It was a burden to carry it that way, but he wanted it to be ready, just in case. Rounding a short rise in the trail, Johnson looked up to see not one, but 2 grizzly bears, already at full speed, charging toward him. When he first saw them, the bears were only 15 feet away, and in strides that can cover 10 feet, would be on him before he could do anything, including discharge his bear spray. He fiddled with the safety cap, but couldn't get it off. Out of frustration, Johnson threw the bear spray canister at the bear nearest to him, but it soared uselessly over its head. In sheer terror and surrender, Johnson turned his back toward the charging grizzlies and flopped onto his stomach. In hopes that playing dead would stop the bear attack, Johnson covered his neck with his wrists and spread his feet out a bit to prevent the bears from flipping him over easily. The grizzlies were on him just as he could protect his vital areas. Johnson's neck and head were covered up pretty well, so the first bear bit into his right shoulder, driving its teeth through his scapula and breaking it in two. The muscle and skin covering it were peeled away from the bones by the irresistible power of the bear's jaws. Next, the doctor felt the crushing pressure of a bite on the tricep muscle on the back of the same arm. The bear tossed its head, pulling away muscle and skin from the bones, and the doctor was convinced, severing his brachial arteries and veins. According to medical sources, the brachial artery pumps between 5 and 90 milliliters of blood each minute, meaning that Johnson could be losing up to 1 of his 10 pints of blood every 5 minutes following the injury, and that is from only one of his many wounds. After tearing up Johnson's right shoulder and arm, the bear turned its attention to his left shoulder. It drove its 2-inch-long teeth clear to the bone in several painful bites. Punctures the size of a nickel left blood seeping from wounds that were more than flesh deep. Suddenly a peace washed over Dr. Johnson. A vivid memory of time spent at the family cabin flooded into his mind. He fondly remembered playing on the dock with his children. The doctor was comfortable with the thought of meeting his Maker and seeing heaven. All the noise of his screams and the bear's grunts washed away, and silence settled in. Down the trail about 400 yards, the 3 men were catching their breath, with Johnson having gone out of their view over a small rise in the trail. They all stopped and looked at each other when they heard a strange, high-pitched noise coming from up the trail. It didn't sound like Johnson's voice, but they couldn't tell what it was. The noise went on for a few seconds, then stopped, before starting again. It stopped one more time, before continuing a third time, before silence. Although they had no idea of any animal they knew of making such a noise, the men thought something wasn't quite right. They ran up the trail and toward the noise, bear spray canisters firmly in hand. They shouted Johnson's name, but received no reply. Unbeknownst to the men, their shouts for Dr. Johnson and their brisk approach to the attack scene sent the grizzlies into a rapid retreat. Arriving at Johnson's side, they found him partially tucked beneath a log. Green's bulky camera case was obliterated during the attack and likely saved Johnson from further injury. They could see he was a bloody mess, with horrible gaping wounds on his shoulders and large chunks of his flesh torn from his arm. Blood soaked his clothes as he implored the men to leave him and save themselves. He thought the bears were still nearby and would attack his friends just like they had attacked him. Now this is the part where Reed's professional training kicks in. Utilizing his first responder training, he assessed Johnson's wounds and applied dressings to them. Johnson was so convinced that he would die, he asked Aaron to record his farewell to his wife and family. His friend obliged and began to record Johnson as he stammered, "Miranda, Haley, Ian, Elise, Mom and Dad, I'll see you in heaven." Reed knew that he had to focus Johnson on winning the battle of the mind. He could see how horribly the doctor's arm and shoulder were mangled, but calmed him by saying, "It's just your arm, Brad. It's just your arm." Having experienced the most terrifying event of his life to this point, Johnson argued with Reed, stating, "No, it's not." He repeatedly told his friends to leave him, telling them that the bears got an artery and they should save themselves. Still recording, Theron prayed out loud for protection and that Johnson would live. After Reed packed Johnson's wounds with gauze, his concern turned to getting to a safer area and away from the grizzlies. Reed lifted Johnson to his feet and aided him to an open area about a quarter of a mile away. He spread out that white tarp as a beacon to passing helicopters to mark their location. Reed piled up sticks and logs, preparing a signal fire in case an aircraft flew overhead. Reed returned to the attack scene to retrieve sleeping bags, as well as other hikers' backpacks. Given he was the only one who could offer any medical attention to Johnson, Theron and Green were appointed to hike out and get help. As they half-jogged and half-walked their way down the trail, they carried their bear spray, a whistle, and a water bottle. After several miles, the men were exhausted and their muscles began cramping, limiting their progress. At one point, Theron cried out, "Lord, send us a mountain runner who can get out of here faster than we can." Green later expressed frustration at Theron's precise request, urging him to broaden his request out a little bit. Suddenly 2 people appeared along the trail near the men. Katie Surovsky was a mountain runner and was exactly who Theron cried out for. Katie ran as fast as she could until she was able to receive cell service about 3:45 p.m. She contacted 911 and a medical helicopter was dispatched to Granite Lake soon thereafter. Back near the tarp, Reed could see that Johnson was entering a death spiral. Shock was setting in, and Johnson walked the line between maintaining or losing consciousness. Reed spent his professional career trying to save lives and was now trying to keep his friend from dying. He wrapped Johnson in sleeping bags to stave off hypothermia. Reed was providing Johnson a sip of water when he heard the whacking of an approaching helicopter. As the Guardian flight helicopter crested the ridge around Granite Lake, they could see a large white object on the ground. It was the tarp Green had brought, now being used to signal the pilot where Reed and Johnson were located. Park County search and rescue medics landed about a mile away and hiked to the tarp to administer first aid to Johnson. They carried him to a location where the medical helicopter could land. They loaded Johnson on board and immediately headed to St. Vincent's Hospital in Billings, Montana. Dr. Johnson spent 8 days enduring 3 surgeries in the hospital. Upon examining Johnson, the medical staff listed his injuries as nerve damage to his pinky fingers on both hands, dozens of puncture wounds around each of his shoulders, a broken scapula and a broken elbow, and his tricep muscle was torn away from his right arm. The pictures of Dr. Johnson's attack are gruesome and illustrate the power of a grizzly bear. I've uploaded them to the Patreon account linked below for your review. I do want to warn you, they're graphic and not for the faint of heart. Green and Theron hiked back to the trailhead by 6 p.m. Reed wasn't allowed in the helicopter due to a lack of room, so he waited at Granite Lake for rangers. They arrived at 10:30 p.m. to lead him back to the trailhead by the early morning hours of Monday. On the same day, Reed returned with Wyoming Fish and Game officers to retrieve their backpacks and gear. As they hiked to the location, they encountered several bears tearing apart the backpacks and sleeping bags. It sunk into Reed and the men what may well have happened to him had they not retrieved him when they did. Johnson maintains that he has no lasting psychological effects or pain from the bear attack, stating he's left with an abiding love for his family and friends, and a perspective that prevents anything from bothering him. The hikers are not allowing the attack on Johnson to keep them away from the mountains either. They immediately planned a return trip to the Beartooths with their families. As for the grizzly bears, the investigation by wildlife officials included returning to the attack site several times. They analyzed the bear tracks and concluded Johnson's attack was defensive after they located evidence the bears had been feeding on pine nut caches nearby. There were tracks from multiple grizzlies in the area, and the bears that attacked Johnson were estimated to weigh around 400 pounds apiece. No action was taken against the bears as a result of Johnson's attack. To hear Dr. Johnson's full recounting of the attack in his own words, you can access it by the link in the video article below. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I have a few questions for you. Why do you think the bears tore up the hikers' backpacks after they left? Would the bears have attacked Reed had he been there much longer? What do you make of the series of events, i.e., the white tarp, the camera case, and finding a mountain runner after the prayer forum that contributed to saving Dr. Johnson's life? I will gladly read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to Kodiak Island in the Kodiak archipelago of islands in South Alaska. There are more than 12 islands in this archipelago, with Kodiak Island being the largest, and the second largest being Kodiak Island. The plant life are similar on each island in the archipelago, and include pockets of spruce and hemlock trees, with an abundance of scrub alder and willow bushes covering every bit of ground that isn't covered with grass and sedge. Common animals here include Roosevelt elk, mountain goats, and Sitka black-tailed deer. The list of predators here is a much shorter list than normal, consisting of brown bears as the sole large predator. Kodiak is a low-lying island, with most of it being sloped, and the highest peaks rising only to 2,350 feet in elevation. The tangled brush and slower-running streams make it prime territory for brown bears. In fact, there are as many brown bears per square mile as there are people over the state of Alaska, a ratio of 1.1 per square mile. Imagine hiking, hunting, or fishing in an area where every mile you walk, statistically, has one massive and potentially angry brown bear. Somehow this concentration of bears doesn't keep hunters away. Many of them sneak through the trees or set up on the edge of grassy meadows, hoping to catch a blacktail moving through. Some of them even use calls to try to lure deer into the open, but sounding like the prey of the world's largest land predator assumes an awful amount of risk.
During hunting season from August through December, residents and hunters of the island often encounter the brazen Bruins as they forage for pre-hibernation calories, and not all of these encounters end in bluff charges. 40-year-old Scott Oberlinter was an avid hunter and had been hunting the islands of the archipelago for the past 6 years in pursuit of blacktails. A friend who was employed at the Kitoi Bay Fish Hatchery had helped him coordinate his hunts, but Scott figured this might be his last trip to the island, since his friend was moving on to a new job soon. Scott was from Anchorage and was very familiar with dealing with the massive bears here. Just about every time he'd hunted here, he'd been charged by a bluffing brownie with a bad attitude. Each time it ended up with relief as the bear pulled up and disappeared into the brush after momentarily terrifying Scott and anyone he was with. A few years prior to this fall, an ill-tempered boar had charged Scott and his partner twice. Both times it stopped its charge only a few yards from them, popping its jaws and woofing at their violation of his territory. It stood to its hind legs as a demonstration of its size and power before slowly walking away. On Wednesday, October 27, 2010, Scott was hunting with a fellow hunter whom we'll refer to as Tim. The men had stalked the hillside and managed to harvest one of the blacktails and were walking toward it to start gutting it. Scott was approaching the spot they'd seen the deer fall when Tim yelled, "Bear!" These two hunters had run into bears plenty of times while hunting deer before, and they had a practice protocol they would use to deal with the tense standoffs. They knew better than to push toward the deer carcass, and generally tried retreating up the nearest hill that would lead them further from the bear. Remaining calm and thinking clearly was pivotal to staying safe, and neither of the men allowed the standoff to rile them. Generally, the brown bears would prefer the deer carcass over chasing down a person, generally. Now, Scott carried a .375 Holland & Holland hunting rifle, which is considered a medium-bore rifle. They are frequently used to dispatch bears and elk, but it is a preferred rifle for African elephants, lions, and water buffalo, as well as tigers. With a 300-grain bullet traveling at 2,530 feet per second, it can impart 4,263 foot-pounds of energy, which in non-gun nerd speak is a lot. Smaller custom rounds can be used to hunt deer, but generally the power of the rifle is a bit much for an animal their size. But deer weren't the only animals the men would run into on this trip. As soon as Tim's words hit Scott's eardrums, his vision filled with the form of a massive brown bear streaking toward him from only 5 paces. Scott's reaction was more instinctive than deliberate as he shouldered his rifle and fired without using his scope. A chill crossed his mind as he knew this bear would cover the distance between them in well under a second. He was essentially trying to snap-shoot a charging and furious 650-pound ball of agitated muscle, and knew the odds were nowhere near in his favor. Just as Scott fired, Tim also fired his rifle. Both shots were as useless as throwing a marble at a freight train, unless they shattered the bear's shoulder or leg bones, and Scott had no such luck. With no time for a second shot, the only thing Scott could do was do his best impression of a bullfighter's spin, to try to dodge the impact of the charging bear. The significant difference between the moves of a matador and the moves Scott used is that bears and bulls move in dramatically different ways. The charging bear plowed into Scott mid-spin and launched him flying backward in a violent ballet. As soon as he impacted the ground, the sow smashed each of her front paws into Scott's corresponding arm as she ran through him. She stopped only a few feet past him and spun to drive her teeth into his leg and shook her head violently. The pain was the only thing that seemed real, as the entire event seemed to take on the surrealism of a nightmare. After tearing her teeth through the flesh of his leg, the enraged sow bit onto his butt, and he heard and felt her teeth forcefully click as they struck his hip bones. She picked him up and tossed him back and forth before throwing him unceremoniously across a downed log. Scott heard a few of his ribs crack as he struck the log, which was the first and most significant pain of his attack to this point. Venting her rage on Scott apparently took a bit of the sow's energy. After tossing him onto the log, she paused to huff and breathed heavily while straddling him. A thunderous shot rang out from Tim's direction, and the sow dropped in instant death. Her dead carcass rolled harmlessly off of Scott's back as he still lay across the log. Tim didn't pause to relish the remarkable and life-saving shot he'd just pulled off. He rushed to his hunting partner's side and looked into gaping gashes and painful punctures seeping blood. It oozed from various injuries, from several places on Scott's lower body, but there didn't seem to be any spurting injuries indicative of a severed artery or vein. Tim wrapped Scott's wounds as best he could and helped his friend to his feet after using his cell phone to call their friend at the nearby hatchery. For the 2-mile hike down to the lake shore, every dark shape formed an imagined angry bear. Each leaf rustled by the breeze brought flashbacks of the charging bear to Scott's mind. After reaching the boat on the lakeshore, the hunters motored across the lake and met up with Don, who had left the Cotoy Bay Salmon Fish Hatchery to meet the men. From there, Scott was flown to Kodiak Island Medical Center, where his injuries were cleaned and sutured shut. He was grateful when one of the Alaska Fish and Game biologists hosted him in his home for the night before the injured hunter was shuttled back to Anchorage to heal at his own home. The following day, Alaska Fish and Game investigators converged on the site of Scott's attack and located the bear's carcass. In Alaska, the state claims any animal carcass killed in self-defense, likely to discourage people from killing bears and claiming it. The sow is noted as being on the smaller side for bears on the island, which biologists point out would put her somewhere between 600 and 700 pounds in the fall. As they removed the sow's hide, they noted that each of the men's first shots were fatal, striking her lungs and organs near them. They noted that neither of the first rounds fired struck any of the large bones of her shoulder, legs, or spine, which allowed the enraged sow to attack Scott, even while mortally wounded. Tim's last shot was the coup de grace, which snuffed out her life and sent her carcass from atop of Scott. As he healed, Scott pondered whether he would be able to venture back into the woods. He'd used one of the most powerful hunting rifles to defend himself from the bear, but she walked through the bullets like nothing. Sneaking around the woods and running into another bear doesn't appeal as much to Scott after the attack. With the sow's death, authorities returned to the area to search for her 2 cubs. Their search yielded no information regarding the cubs' location or condition. They concede that without their mother, the cubs stand very little chance of survival and will likely be eaten by another bear before hibernation. After reviewing the details of Scott's attack, I'm left with a few questions for you. Does the information in this episode change your mind on how much firepower is needed to stop even a small brown bear? Do you think this sow was a dinner bell bear, using the rifle shot or the deer's blood trail to claim the deer carcass? What do you think happened to her cubs? Are you surprised that a brown bear can handle 2 high-powered rifle shots through vital organs and live long enough to kill or maim a human being? I think I'll be leaving the black-tailed deer on the archipelago to the bears. I'll be glad to read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the quaint mountain town of Pine in Jefferson County, Colorado. The town is just across the southern boundary of the Arapahoe National Forest District. It's located at nearly 7,000 feet in elevation, and nearby Banner Peak reaches about 8,100 feet high. The climate here is considered a semi-arid continental climate, with 4 distinct seasons, and winters that can see up to 95 inches of snow accumulation. There are only 105 days of the calendar year with measurable precipitation here, providing abundant recreational opportunities. The forests are comprised of 5 species of pine, 2 species of spruce, 3 species of fir, and 2 species of cottonwood, as well as quaking aspen and Rocky Mountain juniper. Animals here include bighorn sheep, mountain goats, elk, mule deer, and the occasional moose. Common predators here include bobcats, coyotes, and cougars, but the black bears of the area are the most dangerous of all. On the evening of August 26, 2019, 71-year-old John Johnson and his wife, Georgianne Fields, were cooking hamburgers for dinner. They took their plates downstairs into their living room to watch television and spend quality time together. It had been a warm day, at least for the area, with temperatures having peaked at 78 degrees, but had now dropped to the lower 70s by evening. John and Georgianne would routinely open their windows and leave the screens on the doors to keep the skeeters out and allow the air to flow through their home. Around 8:30 p.m., the couple had reclined when they heard some noise upstairs in the kitchen. Raccoons were known to raid the garbage cans and would be bold enough to sneak in on rare occasions. John thought he would go upstairs and chase the unwelcome raccoon off before putting up the hamburger fixings left on the counter. He plodded up the stairs and hoped to take care of business with the pesky invaders. At the top of the staircase, he turned into the kitchen and came nose to nose with a much larger invader than he had anticipated. The massive black bear sow had been enjoying some hamburger buns with her 2 cubs before John's rude interruption. She wasn't immediately aggressive toward John, and they both temporarily froze and stared at each other for a few seconds. The sow turned away from John and started walking away until her cubs bounced into the kitchen. That's when she decided he was too close to her cubs for comfort. She spun on her heels and swatted him in the nose. Now there's a little information that you should know about John and George Ann. They're both fighters by nature, and more confrontational than most people. Several years before this incident, John had been told by a neighbor that you have to exert yourself as the boss and take an aggressive stance against bears. That advice had run through his head from time to time, and now he was applying it in his own home. As his head spun at the impact of the sow's paw, John swatted her back on the arm. He knew he couldn't move toward the bear for fear of provoking a more aggressive attack, and he couldn't move backward because the bear might attack his wife. John knew he had to exert authority over this bear and show he was the alpha in the situation. He puffed himself up and lifted his arms to look bigger as he growled at the sow. Seeing John threatening her, the sow growled in response to John's aggression. She swatted him, raking her claws across his chest and arms. Each time the sow would swat him, he would punch her back. This tit-for-tat boxing match went on for the better part of a minute before the game was completely changed for the bear. Little did this sow know, she wasn't the only protective mama bear in this house. We've talked before about how protective grandmas can be, and George Ann wasn't about to let that bear tear her beloved husband apart without doing something about it. She grabbed the home defense weapon of preference, her Louisville slugger. As she ran up the stairs, she felt an amazing surge of power overtake her entire body. John slowly gave ground to the sow in the boxing match. His distraction granted George Ann enough room to sneak past him and behind the sow. She stated later that she felt like she was the Louisville slugger. George Ann summoned her inner cavewoman as she reenacted a battle scene that had undoubtedly played out thousands of times over eons. She lifted the bat over her head and brought the bat down, using both hands in repeated blows. She felt stronger than she had ever felt, and the bear was feeling it too. At this point, the sow had been boxed, and now she had literally been battered with a bat. She spun so fast to get away that she knocked a hole in the wall in her cartoonish retreat. The sow blurred through the screen door, followed closely by her cubs. Following the fight, John and George Ann gave each other a high five, grabbed a bag of chips, and popped the top on a couple of beers to relax again. I'm just kidding about that part, but it wouldn't surprise me one bit. George Ann was completely uninjured during the attack, and John received several scratches to his chest, shoulders, and arms during the brouhaha. First responders treated his injuries at the scene, and, in no surprise, he declined to be taken to the hospital because, of course he did. Following the attack, the couple reviewed the footage on the security camera that looks over their back patio. The footage showed the bears approaching the door, sniffing the scent of food coming from it. The sow delicately slid her claws alongside the door and used her nose to push it open before entering. It was almost like she had done this before. She didn't even make any marks on the screen door or damage the screen. Wildlife officers combed the area in search of the bears most of the night before giving up to resume at 5:30 a.m. the following morning. They brought dogs out, and they immediately picked up a scent trail. Shortly before 7 a.m., they located the sow approximately 900 yards from the attack scene. They euthanized the sow due to her entering a human home and inflicting injuries, in strict compliance with policy. Her DNA was sent to the University of Wyoming Forensics Lab, which confirmed she was the bear responsible for John's wounds. They searched for her cubs, but no source indicated if they were found or if anything at all was done with them. George Ann stated that as she aged, she often wondered how she would respond to various threatening circumstances. Her brave and brilliant behavior put to bed any concerns she had about that topic. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Did Georgianne's actions cause you to reconsider your weapon of choice regarding personal safety against a black bear? Do you agree with the sow being euthanized, or do you think she could have been placed in a zoo or a sanctuary? What do you think happened to her cubs? Do you plan to take steps to avoid bringing a bear near your home in the future? I sure hope so. I'll gladly read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it.
Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.